So, Kim, I guess to start here, I would actually love to hear a little bit more about you and what you specialize in and sort of how you got to where you are now. Because I think for the listeners, it'll be really interesting, but for myself as well, because I don't actually know a lot about you. So, um, yeah, let's start with that. Where are you at right now, what you're specializing in, and, how you got to where you are.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like that's a lot of questions.
It
Let's
is.
see.
Feel free
So,
to take as long or as short as you like for this one.
okay, so I'm currently a PhD student at AUT, and I'm also a lecturer for university classes, and then I'm also a personal trainer. So I like to just do a lot of things all at the same time.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I love that.
Let's see. Okay, and then I feel like I missed a few of your questions there. So let's see what got me to this point. So
Yeah.
I did a master's program in kinesiology. And after that, I was like, oh, I'm pretty much done with school now. That seems pretty solid. Like,
Yeah,
I'm good
it's a lot
here.
of study.
And I immediately got pulled into lecturing for a campus in Southern California. And I was like, oh, this is cool. I did that for a little bit. And I still work for that same campus, but online, which has been awesome. And I was kind of like, okay, I feel like I still want to know more. Like, I want to know more things about exercise and physiology and kind of, in this field in general. And then same thing on the personal training side for me. I just felt like there was always something else that I needed to know for working with my clients or just kind of wanting to increase my background and stuff for working with the clients that I do work with. And so I was like, okay, maybe I'll do the PhD thing. Maybe I'll do this. I do a pretty good job between each degree of pushing it off for a while. So I waited like
Mhm.
3 years between my
Oh,
bachelor's
well.
to my master's, and the exact same thing from my master's to my PhD. She's like, no, I'm done. I'm not going to do more
Yeah.
school. And then right at the 3 year mark, I'll be like, okay, let's look at it. Let's just
Yeah,
take a
it's
look.
about the time you need to have a bit of a rest from the books.
Right, exactly. And kind of like recontemplate what I'm doing in life and everything. So I really, really, really wanted to study something looking at sex differences. And particularly because for me, I just kind of always had this thing in my head of like, how can we help women to train more efficiently? And how can we help women to just be stronger? That was kind of like my biggest kind of like quest, like, is there specific things that we can do for, female based programming that really would make a difference? Like, is there something out there, some magic pill, which there's not, is there some sort of
Right.
like amazing programming that if we get it just right, that we can really make this difference for women and their training? And so I
Mm.
kind of went down this route. I was like, okay, I want to do my PhD, something in this sort of realm. And doing a little bit of searching and everything, I kind of came across like a menstrual cycle and menstrual cycle based programming and working with the menstrual cycle. I was like, oh, this is good. This is it. This is what I'm going to study. This is what I'm going to
Amazing.
do a PhD in or set. And so I just kind of took off with that and was just looking around for, opportunities to be able to pursue that. And I was lucky to find that at AUT. So that's how I
Yeah.
got here.
That's awesome. No, I really love it because I think when I came across you, I'd already been kind of looking into some of the differences in some of the sex differences between male and female, when it comes to training and nutrition, and reading a few different things and hearing some different viewpoints. And then when I saw that you were actually, doing research on this particular subject at AUT, I was like, okay, perfect. This is someone I need to chat to because it comes up a lot with my clients and just general people that I chat with, as I think the demographic of people who are interested in gaining muscle and strength starts to include a lot more females, which is super exciting. There's also a lot more questions around, well, does my training have to change? Does my nutrition have to change? Is can I just follow a program that a male has done the exact same thing and get the same response? And so there's this, I guess, this idea going around at the moment around, the fact that women shouldn't just be doing the same as men. So I guess I wanted to dive into that a little bit further. But before we do, Kim, I'd love to hear your own experiences with training. And I guess you were obviously interested in training before studying kinesiology. Is that what you're studying? Um,
Yeah, kinesiology is what we call
Kinesiology.
exercise
Yeah, I don't know what we call
science,
that
or what do we
here in
call it?
New
Sports
Zealand.
science. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
don't know
Cool.
why we use that term in the States, but all the departments here are
Yeah.
kinesiology departments, and then you specialize in exercise science or exercise
Oh, okay.
physiology and
I
stuff
got
like
you.
that. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I've
that's
always
not a New
struggled with that
Zealand term at
word.
all.
Um, Yeah, no, that's cool. So yeah, you're obviously already interested in training before going into those studies. So I'd love to hear about your own journey there, and and what that sort of has evolved to now in your own training, and how you like to implement strength training.
Yeah, for sure. Let's see. So I was one of those athletes in high school and even into university where I was really, really not focused, like extremely not so. So I would bounce around from sport to sport, and I was like just okay enough at everything, like enough that people wanted me on their team, but I wasn't like the best.
Yeah,
It's kind of like, yeah, I'm all right. I'm
yeah.
okay at everything. So I did like basketball and cross country, volleyball, rowing. I
Wow.
did all the different sports. I did soccer, all sorts of stuff, and never settled into anything. I continued with rowing for a while, but even with that, I was like, I'm just not like, it just wasn't something I was like, I need to stick with this. I've, again, always been good at doing a lot of different things at the same time rather than really specializing in one thing, which is
Hmm.
probably less ideal if you want to really excel in a sport. You do
100%.
need to
Yeah.
just stick with that sport. So I did a lot of different things. And one thing I really found in high school, in my experience, was that I just felt like there was literally almost no implementation of strength training for the girls teams. It was just kind of like maybe once a month or something, kind of, oh, here, go do this, one exercise because the guys are doing it and we don't have anything else for you to do because the weather's bad. Like it just wasn't really, there wasn't really any sort of strength training program. And I had got injured all the time. I was constantly, getting weird injuries. I tore my ACL, doing all sorts of stuff with my ankles and everything, all sorts of things. And looking back at it, I just always am like, oh, if only I was doing more strength training. I maybe would have gotten injured less. I don't know. I maybe would have been a little bit better at the sport. I don't know. But at least it would have been productive. I would have probably really gained a lot from it. So I always found that was just really disappointing that at that time and in that age level and in the community I was in, that just wasn't something that we were doing that much. It was like, I remember doing a lot of like sit-ups and crunches and stuff. I don't know if that was any good,
Right.
but like, I don't
Yeah.
remember ever, like I had never like picked up a barbell or anything like that until like, college age, university. And so I got into strength training when I was an undergrad, just because of the access to gym, and it was just kind of like something to do. And I was like, sure, let's kind of try this. And that was very, very kind of preliminary, like those like body pump type classes, just like with
Yeah.
those little short barbells and stuff. But I was like, this is great. Like I can get so into this and stuff. And then
Cool.
I kind of fell into personal training just because I really liked exercise and I seemed to know a little bit more about it than some other people. So I was like, therefore I'm super qualified. So I should go into personal training. And I did this like 2-month class at a community college, and I was so into it and stuff.
Great.
And so that was kind of how I learned about it. And then I got into CrossFit. I joined, a little bit of that wave, not super intensely so, but a little bit so. And so that was kind of more my introduction into like strength training and, working with actual weights and things like
Mm,
that. So that was
mm.
pretty fun. I did that for a few years. And then I've always continued running. I love trail running. Right now, my workouts are just divided between doing some kind of like my strange version of varying strength training with some sort of trail running
Awesome.
just trying to train both at the same time with,
Mhm.
limited success in both. But I enjoy it.
Yeah.
So that's what works.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think that's a real like that's something that a lot of us within my circle at the moment are doing as well, is combining the running and the lifting, and although we know that it's not optimizing either one, it's like,
Yeah.
okay, we want to do both and we enjoy both in this current season. Like we're working towards a marathon, and it's like, we can do our best programming wise, nutrition wise to enhance both of those, and just acknowledging that, I'm not going to be the best in either one, but this is what's enjoyable for me right now. And I think it's a great way to train. So it sounds like you've had a lot of history in different activities and sports. And I guess retrospectively, looking back on that time at high school, where there was like the guys doing the weight training for their specific sports, and there was this kind of like, I guess, there's there's a lot of underlying themes there of like patriarchy and sexism and things like this, right? But retrospectively, looking at that for yourself, do you think that was a bit of a spark for you to want to go further into what you're studying now, to try and, I guess, improve the image of weight training and females for the whole, I guess, female population? Is that something that is an underlying theme for you, or a passion for you, is to see more ladies lifting, and specifically even getting it into schools and sports teams and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure. I think definitely for me, a huge area that I really would like to work more into is definitely ways in which to get younger females involved in strength training, at like the high school level and even a little earlier and stuff, because I think it is super important and be super useful. I would say I kind of wish that I could say, oh yes, this sparked this passion in me at that age or something like that. But now I'd say it's much more recent. I would say for me though, the thing that really got me was that so I was always like a decent runner and stuff, even at pretty young ages. And I remember in, I don't know, elementary school, middle school, being faster than most other guys. And then, I'd be able to come in like second in the class or something at like the mile run. And then hitting this point though, where all of a sudden it was like more and more guys were getting faster and less girls were. And I was like, wait a second, what is happening here? And feeling really like, how did this happen? Why is this so unfair? And I think that's where it kind of I just always had this thing in my mind of like, is there something to help women kind of keep catching up, kind of keep at that next level, closer and closer to their male counterparts? And I think that when I kind of realized, there is some connection here in the strength training part, like that's when it finally kind of connected. Like, wait a second, they're doing all this time, spending all this time building muscle, and already naturally with their testosterone levels are building more muscle. And we're just not, doing those activities to enhance that as well for ourselves. And so I think realizing that was like, wait a second.
That's really interesting. And so with the research that you're doing now at AUT, I mean, obviously you probably can't go into a huge amount of details of what you're looking to study for your PhD, but is there anything that you can let the listeners know and what you're looking to understand through your current research?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't know if there's anything that I shouldn't talk about. I will gladly talk about anything.
Great.
Yeah. Let's see. So I went into AUT with this concept of looking specifically at menstrual cycle phase-based resistance training, trying to make programming that lines up with someone's menstrual cycle in specific phases. And so that was what I was kind of like super set on when I started the program and what I was looking at. And what I kind of ended up going down was realizing that, one, just the menstrual cycle was way complicated, which is like, I knew it was going to be complicated, but I was like, oh, this is really complicated. It's what, it's the classic, like, the more you learn about something, the more you realize you don't know type of thing. And
totally.
So kind of going down that route, and then realizing like, essentially it's kind of like I went in with this really focused, and then realized I needed to kind of zoom out and look at the whole picture more. And I realized that there was just a lot of other things that needed to be considered before one could even dive into the idea of the phase-based training. So for example, with like, what is a regular menstrual cycle? What is cycle regularity? What is regular in athletes? Is that the same as what's regular in non-athletic populations? And once I kind of was starting to look into all this, I realized, I feel like what needs to be established is more what is regular and what's not. And so that's kind of what some of my focus has been, is actually trying to look at especially resistance trained but athletic female populations, just what is the normal in this population, what is seen often, what's not, use of hormonal contraceptives, what percent of the population is using that, what percent have some sort of cycle irregularity. And so for me, that's kind of actually been some of the focus of my research, is just looking at, in the population who participates in resistance training, what is just kind of our regular baseline, because we need that to be able to establish how to build programming for it. Because otherwise it's like you're trying to build programming for something you don't even know what it really is. So that's kind of become the focus of my research. And then I also started to realize, after I did this survey of 900 participants, asking just a bunch of questions about menstrual cycle and experiences and lived experiences and all that sort of stuff. And I got this really big kind of like flag put in front of me after looking at a lot of the survey responses, that a lot of the kind of side that I hadn't even really thought about was the psychological aspect. So specifically things like body image and how that has an effect on someone's menstrual cycle. And so that's kind of what's directed me into this next phase of my research, which is specifically looking at the psychological components of what are the effects of the menstrual cycle, and how can potentially a psychological intervention help someone with any sort of menstrual cycle symptoms or irregularity.
Wow, really interesting stuff. So I guess what is the current state of the literature on this kind of area that you're looking into? Is there a lot of, studies that have already been done specifically looking at, menstrual cycle and training within those different phases, and how it relates to strength and hypertrophy? And I guess, why do you think this kind of research that you're looking into doing is really important?
Wait, sorry. The connection froze for a second there.
No, that's cool.
Can you say that question one more time?
Yeah, totally. So the question was basically, what's the current state of the literature on research around, the current, the evidence that the research that you're looking into doing around, training within different phases of the menstrual cycle, and how that relates to strength and muscle mass. Like, what is the current state of the literature on that? And then why is, I guess, you looking into this research really important, do you think?
Yeah. Okay. So the current information that's out there as far as menstrual cycle phase-based training is very small. I mean, no surprise, that's not like on the top of everyone's research list before. Now maybe it is, but so there's 4 studies that I'm aware of that are out there that have looked at this very specific area, and 3 of them found a significant difference from menstrual cycle phase-based training. But the big caveat here is that they were very, very kind of laboratory type studies where they're doing unilateral training. So training one leg differently from the other leg, which I can assume that a vast majority of the population is not trying to train one leg separately from the other leg in most strength training settings. And then the other studies was looking at unilateral with arms. So that's all 3 of the studies we're looking at that way. There's been no study that's been done with a population of people with regular menstrual cycles doing what I would call a regular strength training program, some sort of full body, some sort of just anything that you would think of as a normal strength training program. And so I think that's why it's quite hard to draw any sort of conclusions with those studies. Is like they were it was a super cool idea, super novel. And I think those researchers that did that, it was awesome what they did. But I think it's so preliminary. It's hard to say, oh, for sure, this will work for everyone. It's just so early. I mean, it's like one factor with that is that, they studied a population that had never strength trained before. That's fine, maybe not super applicable to everyone. But the thing that I think is challenging is to think about, if you're to get a group of, like say 10 women, the idea that all 10 of them will have a regular menstrual cycle that you could program to is very unlikely. So most of the time, in most, surveys and stuff that are out there, about 50% of females are using some form of hormonal contraceptive. Okay, so that 50% chunk has a totally different menstrual cycle than the other 50%, right? And so when we're talking about this phase-based training, we're talking about those within natural menstrual cycle, not ones that are using hormonal contraceptives, because the hormonal contraceptives totally changes any of these hormonal effects that we're supposedly programming for, right? Because it's the whole reason why we're changing this programming is for hormones. Then we need to think about, okay, what is the actual hormonal environment that someone's experiencing? So hormonal contraceptives would give someone basically a pretty steady level of similar hormones across their cycle, as opposed to natural cycle, which ebbs and flows quite a bit more in hormones. So if we're thinking about making this programming for the natural menstrual cycle, we probably should take out the 50% that are using hormonal contraceptives. Okay, cool. So now, out of our group of 10, we're down to 5. Great. Out of that group, the likelihood that all 5 of them have a regular menstrual cycle, so meaning that it kind of meets all the hormonal criteria, the same length of days, the same length in each phase and everything, is quite small, most likely somewhere, again, depending on the group and depending on the individuals, somewhere between 10 to maybe 15 or 20% are going to have some sort of cycle irregularity. So whether that's like endometriosis, amenorrhea, PCOS, any of those conditions that cause someone's cycle to be different are, again, going to have a very different hormonal environment that they're experiencing. And therefore, again, if we're making the programming for those specific types of hormonal changes, we need to take that into account. So let's say that maybe one of our group of 5 now is gone. Now we're making programming for 4 women out of what was originally 10. Is that really all that logical then, that we're going to create, a separate program just for those 4, and then the other 6, I don't know, we'll just do something else for them, And
Right.
so it's just kind of, we're left in a situation where it's like again, it's more questions than answers. We've got like basically this little bit of an idea, this little kind of like, carrot to grab onto, but we don't have any great evidence to say, oh, and this is how to actually use it. This is how to actually build this or to actually apply this in any sort of setting.
Yeah. And so I guess that comes back to like the majority of females who have taken up strength training, recently, it's just generally, hey, we'll just do what the guys do. And maybe we'll change a few exercises to target specific muscle groups that maybe females want to improve more than guys. But, generally the phasic structure of the training will be very similar. So I guess for the listeners, I think this will be really helpful for a lot of guys listening as well, just because they don't have the education and this aspect. And I think, it should be something that's more talked about specifically for guys so they can understand more what's going on with, the ladies around them and their partners and things like this, as opposed to, having this kind of almost veil over the whole thing and keeping it separate from guys' knowledge, is outlining what an average cycle actually looks like and what the different phases of a cycle is, and how they differ from each other, and I guess how they differ in what an individual is feeling during those times, due to those differences in ebbs and flows of those hormones.
Yeah. So I totally agree. I think that menstrual cycle education should be across the board. There should be no, male or female specific education on this one. And one thing that does sometimes surprise me is that there's actually a lot of males sometimes who have gone, like say coaches or, who've worked with different athletes that go through wanting to learn a lot more about this, which I think is awesome. And then surprisingly, a lot of women who have just somehow missed getting that knowledge, actually they themselves haven't learned that much about it either. So, I sometimes find it interesting when talking to a group to assume, the women will know about this and the men not. And sometimes you got kind of a switch back and forth there. So good. I think this should, totally be an all people can be included on these sort of conversations for sure. So the regular menstrual cycle, we have our textbook example, as everyone calls it, which is not, I would say, more people don't have this type of cycle than people who do. But overall, our average textbook cycle would be a 28-day cycle. So that from the first day that the period starts to the last day before the next period is 28 days in total length. And again, probably more women don't have this than do, but this is what we consider the regular average is 28 days in length, with ovulation someplace around the middle. Again, the textbook would say day 14. Ovulation can be anywhere from like day 7 to day 21, which is why sometimes that can be a little confusing for people. But so with our ovulation there in the middle. And so if you think about this as like a graph going across, so we start, on the left side with day 1 of the period and then day 28 on the other side. The first half is our follicular phase. It's just a name for it, just when the follicle is developing. And then our second half is the luteal phase. And so there's different names for subsections within each phases, but just to keep it, simple and clean, we'll just go follicular phase and luteal phase. And so we basically have early follicular is the beginning of the period. Then we have late follicular, which is the lead up to ovulation, and then we have the early luteal, which is right after ovulation, and then the late luteal, which is what we would call like PMS, or that premenstrual time, is where that would happen, is that late luteal phase. So the big difference is that in the follicular phase, estrogen is the dominant hormone. So that's the rise of estrogen. It makes these, beautiful kind of curving, undulated curves on our printed cycle here. And so that's in the follicular phase. And then at ovulation, we get a nice little peak of estrogen, goes back down. Of course, there's other hormones that are peaking there as well. And then progesterone stays at kind of a nice lower state until ovulation, where it starts to make its rise in the luteal phase. So the biggest difference is for when we're thinking about, say, like programming and hormones and stuff, is just that follicular phase has estrogen as a dominant hormone and luteal phase has progesterone as a dominant hormone. Again, both phases all have other hormones, both hormones, etc. But that's kind of just the way we think about it a lot as far as the physiological impact of the hormones. So again, 28 day cycle, we got ovulation in the middle, dividing the estrogen dominated phase and the progesterone dominated phase. Okay, then when you're talking about the effects and what's changing from one part of the cycle to the next, this is just so variable from person to person and from each cycle. So for one woman to compare one cycle to the next, there's going to be a huge amount of variation as well, which is, again, why it gets really complicated, because you can't just say, well, this person always gets this, because they won't. They'll get it sometimes and maybe not always. But so the estrogen dominance in that follicular phase seems to be this time where, when we're looking at this in the studies, is the time where the body's potentially, like maybe, we don't know for sure, able to handle a little higher training load or a little bit more intensity or recover better or something like that. It's like there's just a lot of little pieces of data that we have there. And then during the progesterone dominated phase, that seems to go down a little bit with the increase in progesterone. Again, though, it's like, we don't know this for sure. This is, again, just when we're looking at these phase-based studies, what they see. There's some specific physiological markers that change. So, for example, naturally, the basal body temperature rises after ovulation from progesterone. So progesterone does increase the metabolic rate of the body, increases the temperature of the body. So we see, so that's how like using temperature to monitor ovulation and stuff works, is that we're looking for that rise in temperature that's coming from progesterone in the luteal phase, which does have a little bit of effect in if someone, say, is doing, endurance training outside in the heat or something, they may notice that increase in body temperature, or less of an ability to cool the body. But again, not everyone will notice that. But when we look at studies and data, that is something that is pretty consistent across the board that most women will experience. We'll also see changes like changes in resting heart rate. So resting heart rate goes up a little bit during when the progesterone's higher. We also see these little changes in substrate metabolism, so the utilization of carbs versus fat. But again, it's like these are all just like little things that when we see average, it's like, oh yeah, that does seem to be a pattern. But I would say that for each individual, this probably varies a ton. It's probably
Mm,
very different about how much this is changing. But so from these changes in hormones and these physiological changes, some people will experience differing symptoms. So some people find that during their higher level of estrogen time, that they feel really good, they have high energy, they're able to do a lot more, and that during the progesterone height, they don't feel that as much. They feel kind of more flat, they feel more tired, they need to sleep more, they feel like they need to eat more and stuff like that. Again, some people might feel the reverse. Some people
mm,
might not even feel that difference. So um, when we're thinking about other like those stereotypical sort of like changes, like the emotional side, mood swings, being overly irritable and things like that, that's typically seen in the luteal phase, so in that second half of the cycle with that rise and fall in progesterone. But again, it's just not always that consistent. People
mm.
can be angry and moody at any time in their cycle. It doesn't need to be in a specific time.
Totally.
But again, some people may really notice that and notice that experience as well.
Yeah, I love all of that. And I think, we have to be so careful, I guess, with a topic like this that starts to gain more traction in the fitness industry and it starts to become a bit of a hot topic. It's very easy for people to start throwing out like blanket statements, black and white statements around how the menstrual cycle does affect an individual. And I think so much of the time it just leaves out so much of the nuance that's in this topic, because like you've been repeating, it's just there's so much variability between individuals that it's very hard to just say, oh, all females should feel more energetic in the follicular phase, or all females will experience huge amount of cravings during PMS, or whatever it may be. I think there's just so much variability there, and as soon as you start putting out these black and white statements, it's I guess there's this whole thing of like the psychological aspect of, if I hear that I'm going to be more lethargic in the luteal phase, then maybe I will just be more lethargic. Like I guess that like placebo effect, I guess it would be, right? Is like you start to accept that for yourself, as opposed to actually beginning to tune into your own body and see what you're actually feeling, and understand how it's affecting you, and I guess not take some kind of black and white rule as the be all and end all for how you're going to experience your menstrual cycle. So I guess the big thing I want to I want to take away from a discussion on this is, because we've got all these little snippets from different bits of data, different research. What is, I guess, from your perspective now, the practical implications of those different phases of the cycle, and how that's going to affect somebody's training in the gym, and potentially how it's going to affect their response to that training, via muscle protein synthesis and hypertrophy and strength gain.
Yeah, yeah. I want to just touch on what you were saying there with
Go for
that
it.
placebo effect. That is something that I am like always so almost like concerned about in some ways, that if we make these blanket statements as like, you will feel like this at this time at this day, it's like, wow, no surprise, I feel like this, and I think that I get really overly concerned that when, especially like, the fitness industry, whoever that is and wherever they are and stuff, but like, when they grab onto this concept of like, this is what's going to make this big difference in your life. You may have everything else perfect in your life, but it's not yet until you have this one thing and stuff. And I
Mm,
feel like this concept of like, you're not good enough until you do this thing, which I feel like right now is starting to be this idea with like menstrual cycle based training or something, that's like, you're totally messing up if you don't do this one
yep.
thing. I feel like that's like a YouTube tagline of a lot of videos, like, stop doing back squats because of this one thing, never do, or like these
Oh
big
my
claims
gosh, yeah.
that everything is so bad if you're not doing this one thing.
Mm,
And I feel like that could be the same with menstrual cycle phases, or this idea of like, oh, if you trained hard hard on this day in your luteal phase, you're done, like your arm's going to fall off or something. It's going to go terribly. And yeah, I get really nervous with what sort of, are we really helping anyone? Are we really helping anyone with that information, with those statements, rather than telling someone, hey, keep training. If you don't feel good, don't train. It's just super, I think it's a cool opportunity for people to become much more introspective rather than looking outside for how should I feel? How should I train? How should I, plan my life and stuff? And instead think, how do I feel? How does this make me feel? How did I feel after that? And use that information in your own personal data, because all these people who are making, claims or statements and stuff have literally no idea how you feel. They have literally no concept over what is going on inside your body. The only person who does know that is you. And so I think it's such an important opportunity, especially for women, to kind of take back their health into their own hands, rather than thinking it's something that they need to go elsewhere, they need to search elsewhere for, and to, trust these opinions of these, people who probably have fairly limited knowledge in the area, who are telling them, oh, you have to train this way. So I did a really good job talking around that, and now I forgot what your original question was.
No, I love that discussion so much, and I think it's with my clients as well. When I'm working with females, I don't tend to program any differently for their phases, because I'm like, okay, cool. If you're going to be feeling really rubbish for this particular week or whatever it may be, you're going to let me know in your client check-in anyway, and then I can adjust your training as per necessary based off your feelings. But I'm not going to put this idea in your head of like, okay, now it's like week 4, so we're going to really reduce volume here because you're in your luteal phase, and and it's kind of just giving them this idea of like, oh, you're going to have a really shit week. And it's like, no, I'd actually prefer you just to
shitty week.
Yeah, I prefer you just to train as per normal. And then if we give you the autonomy to say, hey, look, if you're feeling really rubbish at any period during this training cycle, then let's take either a low volume session or a low volume week or whatever it may be, and give you that flexibility. But I don't want to, be the dictator here and say, hey, look, this is what we're going to do. And we're going to train purely based off the menstrual cycle. So I guess I want to hand that over to you, Kim, and say, what is the practical implications that you've now come to the conclusion of, like, based off what you've read around the different phases of the cycle and how that relates to strength and hypertrophy?
Right. Now I remember your question. Yep. It's all coming back. I think that's a really, really interesting topic. So, my primary supervisor, who's, just been fantastic throughout this journey, Eric Helms, he had, when we first met, to talk about my project and talk about this menstrual phase-based training and stuff, he said something that I thought was really smart. That was, that obviously, he's been a coach for a long time and has been aware of this type of programming. And he goes, I don't use this. This isn't something I do. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting point. And I would say I'm kind of at the same point too, as a trainer, and even for myself, where I think that we have a lot of interesting data in this. And I think it's super cool, like, tracking, the heart rate across the menstrual cycle. And so, I mean, that's literally what I'm doing in one of my studies. I think it's really interesting, but I don't know that we can do that much with it yet. I don't know that it's that necessarily applicable, because again, because there's so many differences from female to female as to whether or not this research would even apply to them. Again, we had the 6 women versus the 4, the hormonal contraceptives and irregular cycles, a lot of this wouldn't even apply to. And then we have, the 4 at the regular cycle that this is supposedly applying to, again, have so many variations within themselves, because even from woman to woman, in a fairly similar setting, their progesterone levels, for example, might be very different, even though they both have regular cycles. And so I think that when we look at these averages, say, oh, on average, we see this, increase in heart rate, we see this change in substrate metabolism that's noteworthy or something, it's really an average. It's really not that individual person who experienced that. This was just what we showed as a group. And so I feel the same way with the application of that with training, is that this was an average, that we saw for this group of women who didn't have training experience. And so I think it's hard to actually apply that to that much.
Mm.
What I personally do, for myself and for my female clients, is just go off of feel, just like what you were saying, where it's less about like, oh yeah, we have hit week 2, we were ovulating, this is what you're going to be experiencing, and stuff. Because one, actually knowing when someone's ovulating is quite difficult unless you're actively monitoring this, with like pee strips or a blood test, which most of us are not doing with our athletes at any way or any level. So I think it's just really hard to even know exactly what phase someone might be in at varying times. And then also, yeah, just it seems like going off feel works all right. Going
Yeah.
off of that, it's like we haven't massively messed up doing that with people, and we just don't know exactly how to apply this phase-based training yet. So I think that there's just a lot more to figure out. There's just a lot more to figure out before we can actually truly utilize it.
Are there any like common I guess common symptoms or things that ladies would experience within those different cycles in regards to their training? Like, maybe it's like recovery, or maybe they feel stronger, or is there any like common symptoms that we do see across the board?
Yeah. So, in the survey that I did a few months ago, it was really fun actually being able to read through some of the responses and everything. And, again, there's huge variation, but one of the ones that was kind of fun, people could write in their free responses. And one thing that came up so often was bloating and belts. The concept of,
Okay.
so in with the increase in progesterone, for most women, that would be the time of increasing bloating. And normally that'll kind of last through the beginning of their period. Because that increase is causing more water retention, et cetera. And so this bloating sensation that is just so common. It's just so common and so normal. And I think it's a hard one for a lot of women because we've been, just pressed into our heads over and over again about the, like you have to have a flat stomach, you have to have these abs, you have to have this certain body type and stuff that is so far from what is natural for women. Just like so far. It's just like bloating is so normal and so common and, just happens with having a healthy body. It's like having a healthy body is going to have some of these sort of symptoms. And so this common thread of bloating and needing to either not being able to use your weightlifting belt, having to have a different weightlifting belt, for the bloating times, like all that
Wow.
sort of thing. I thought that was just interesting how much of a resonating message that was in that group of 900 women. The other one that was quite common, food cravings. That one's pretty common, which I think, maybe has a little bit to do with that changes in the fact that the body needs a little bit more calories because of the increase in metabolism with progesterone. So it just makes sense. Like your body's like, we need this. Again, your healthy body is trying to survive. It's trying to tell you, you're like, hey, you need to eat a little bit more, maybe a little bit more of this stuff that seems really good, and so the food craving is super common. And then onset or the day before menstruating for most women, cramps are just super common. And in my survey, something like 90% experience menstrual cramps. So it is just very, very common. And for some, that does include not only kind of in the lower abdominal area, but also in the low back. So just this kind of circulating area cramps. And I'd say the next ones after that were things like acne, let's see, the food cravings, the mood swings, things like that. But those are a little bit lower actually on the commonality. The ones that were just the most common was the bloating, the cramps, and the just kind of general pain, headaches. That's another one.
Is that specifically those symptoms? Are they specifically feeling those in like the PMS phase, I guess, and that's right at the end of the luteal phase? Am I correct?
Yeah, so I'd say anywhere from the end of the luteal phase into the beginning of menstruating. So it's that kind of window of in our 28-day cycle from about day 25 or so into day 1 or 2, somewhere in there. And yeah, some women, again, notice it quite a bit more in the luteal phase with that increase in progesterone, and some notice it more at the end of the luteal phase with the decrease in progesterone.
That's really interesting. So I guess from a training perspective, is there anything that you like you said, you don't really adjust too much for yourself. Have you noticed anything like anecdotally for yourself, or even through like the survey you've done, or clients that you've worked with, where you've seen drastic changes in performance based on those different phases? Like, I know that there are some, people like some proponents of I guess phasic structured training for the menstrual cycle that would state that the the best time to test a 1RM, for example, would be in the follicular phase, or and then you might have a deload during your luteal phase. Like, have you experienced any of that yourself in terms of like the performance side of things?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so yeah, anecdotally, I think it is a great side of this. So when we're looking at the studies on phase-based training and the proponents of this and everything, they really emphasize this concept of do all your heavy, hard work in your follicular phase. Oh, cool. Yeah, sounds good. On paper, makes sense. When we look
Yeah.
at these numbers and graphs, yeah, makes sense. Awesome. Practically speaking, the follicular phase starts on the first day of a woman's period. Ask a vast majority of women, how ready are you to train hard today? Most of them are going to be like, no, thank you. That is not my choice. And even for the first like 3 or 4 days after, like vast majority of women I've worked with myself, most of the people, even if you bring up this concept to them, it becomes almost offensive. The idea that like that's your
Yeah.
best time to go hard and do the best you can, and just kind of like I'm doing the best I can to just exist right now, to just stand upright, And so the idea that that should be the hardest part of training, I think, is sometimes a tough pill to swallow, because you're like, I felt fine, say, for example, in your luteal phase when you're supposed to be deloading, and then you feel
Right.
terrible at the beginning of your follicular phase. And you're like, why would I do this? You're like, why
Mhm.
is this a good idea? Why, And so I think that that can be really challenging to try and convince people to do when you're like, yeah, but on the textbook, you should be feeling great right now. You're so strong, and you're at your best. And you're like, I'm not. This is
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
not a good time.
No, that's great. Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Um, I guess there's a couple of more things I wanted to cover with you, Kim, and one of them is potential downsides, or like from your own knowledge or reading, are there any potential downsides of not having a regular menstrual cycle? Like for someone who is using hormonal contraception, and they're not having those regular changes in hormonal levels, or potentially someone who has irregular periods, or relative energy deficiency, where they're not actually seeing a regular menstrual cycle, like amenorrhea or something like that. Are there downsides to someone not actually experiencing that? I guess there's probably a lot of people who would claim that going like natural is best, and if you're not having a menstrual cycle, then you're not allowing your body to do its natural thing, and whatever arguments they have in regards to that. So have you seen any like negative side effects or downsides to not actually having that regular cycle?
Yeah. Okay. So I'd say there's two things that pop into my mind with that question about not having a regular cycle. So the first thing would be, of course, was why the person not having a regular cycle. If it's due to amenorrhea, primary or secondary, meaning the person either never got their period or they have not experienced a period for the past few months, or if it's for hormonal contraceptives, right? So that would be kind of two different situations. And so like someone who's experiencing amenorrhea that is not explained by other, classic thing, pregnancy, breastfeeding, things like that, that all makes sense why that's happening. But where it's unexplained, there's not a specific reason. One thing that is seen oftentimes in athletes is that it's because they're not fueling sufficiently. They're not eating enough for whatever reason, what it is from an eating disorder or not, can just happen, especially with intense training. And so with that type of amenorrhea, there is concern if someone continues down that path that there are long-term health consequences, which is where we come out, with the Red S research or female athlete triad, and the concerns with that. And so that goes back to our hormonal contraceptive question, which is if someone is taking hormonal contraceptives, one of the primary concerns with that is that if someone is at risk for potentially having amenorrhea, we don't know that if they're taking a hormonal contraceptive. So if someone is on a hormonal contraceptive, that essentially will mask the fact that the body's not producing enough of its own natural hormones. And so that's kind of one of the more tricky sides with it, where it's sometimes seen as like, well, they're still getting hormones because they're taking them exogenously. But we don't know whether or not they maybe are at risk for amenorrhea, or if they're experiencing that because they'll still have a withdrawal bleed when they're not taking the birth control pills or whatever method they're using. And so that would be the concern again, because when someone is in a situation where they're not intaking sufficient calories, they're working out super, super hard, training really intensely and stuff, we run into the risk of potentially lower bone density from the lack of estrogen, which would be stimulating the bone growth normally. Since we don't have that circulating, then we run into that concern, and potentially increased risk for injury as well. It just makes sense too, if the body's working really, really hard and not getting the calories it needs to repair itself, we're probably going to run into problems. That's not going to be great. So hormonal contraceptives kind of cover that. And so someone can't necessarily, like covered like a blanket, like you can't see it. And so you don't see that problem. So that's where that concern comes from. The secondary part to that is whether or not hormonal contraceptives will like affect someone's performance or affect their ability to actually, perform at their best and things like that. And I would say that we're still really a long ways from being able to make a good statement about that research wise. There has been some studies that come out that have shown a small percentage difference in those who were taking hormonal contraceptives versus those who weren't, and favoring the natural menstrual cycle over hormonal contraceptives. But the big caveat with that is, of course, why is someone taking hormonal contraceptives? Are they taking it specifically to prevent pregnancy, or are they taking it maybe to treat symptoms? And so if you're to take someone who, I have a really good friend who growing up, she gets, very, very severe menstrual cycle symptoms to the point where she passes out. And that actually became a problem, in sports. It's not great to just black out suddenly, at an unpredictable time because you didn't realize your period's about to start. So would someone who has very extreme symptoms perform better with or without the hormonal contraceptives? Well, I think we need to look at addressing the symptoms, and most likely someone with extreme symptoms will perform better with the hormonal contraceptives, whether or not the hormonal contraceptives may have this minute percentage change in their ability to perform, right? It's outweighed by the benefit of the fact that their symptoms maybe are so much that they can't perform well. So I think that it's always hard when we make this quick rush to judge, like, oh, there was a 2% difference in that group that used hormonal contraceptives and they're 2% less strong, don't use them. And it's like, well, what makes you way less strong? Giving birth. That will also slow you down as well. So I think that I think that we need to think about why someone is taking these, and if they're in a position where they, it's like getting pregnant and recovering from that as an athlete is obviously an amazing feat. And, giving birth is strength in all sorts of other ways. It's incredibly, impressive, but are they going to be able to perform at this elite level athletically immediately after? Probably not. And so the hormonal contraceptives probably would help them if they're in that phase of life where they're more focused on competing athletically. I think that also, again, just thinking about the whole picture of the person is what's really important here, again, rather than looking at, numbers on a graph and looking at, their performance will be slightly hampered and stuff. And then
Mm.
I think the other hard thing too to compare is like if you were to take a person and say, okay, well, let's look at you yourself compared to you yourself at another time, we're using hormonal contraceptives versus not. The fact that there's such a big gap of time that ends up having to pass to be in one phase versus the other phase, to say you didn't use contraceptives and then you did at one time and then go back to it, that's probably multiple years between that. It's so hard to really compare and say, oh, this was a big difference or this wasn't. There's so many other life factors that may come into play there.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Kim. And I think so much of this is coming back to, I guess, the key takeaway of each individual, of each woman being more aware of their own experience, and kind of having that introspective awareness of being able to come back and think a little more, intently about how they're experiencing their menstrual cycle and how that's going to affect their training and their recovery. And I guess a question for you to finish up here, Kim, is like, what would be some best strategies for ladies to become more aware of their menstrual cycle and how they respond and how it affects their performance? Is there certain things that they can track, or is there apps they can use, or is it just a case of actually just waking up in each day and going, hey, how am I feeling?
Yeah, for sure. I think the first piece of advice is definitely, track your menstrual cycle, like whether it's on an app or whether it's just in a note or, piece of paper and stuff. I don't think that there's any like magical, this is the best way to track it, or this is, I think that track as many points that are of interest to you. So I'd say your perception of your recovery, your perception of your exertion, things like that, using like RPE can be useful. Again, it just depends on how detailed you're interested in looking at it, but it's just about like every day for more than one cycle, trying to track, this is how I'm feeling, this is what I'm experiencing, this is what's going on, and then be able to look at that data yourself and see, was there a pattern? Was there something that was going on? I think it's also important, though, to just keep other things in mind. We don't exist in these little perfect bubbles of menstrual cycle calendars, and the fact that there's different life stress, there's different work stress, social things like that come into play, changes in diet, changes in other aspects of life that may also compound some of these issues that women are experiencing, especially like stress is going to have a huge factor on someone's menstrual cycle and the symptoms that they experience. People, when they're in higher stress times, are going to have way more exacerbated symptoms, most likely, because it's just affecting you overall in different ways. So just keep that in mind too when you're tracking your menstrual cycle. Is just, are there other external factors that are maybe really affecting you right now? Because we could have someone keep this amazing menstrual cycle diary, but they are doing so many other things, and they're so involved in other things, or completely changing their diet, or experiencing an illness, or all these other things. And that's like, well, that's maybe taking precedence over whatever is happening with your hormonal environment. But anyway, so I would really recommend, though, for women to try to track for at least 3 cycles to see any major patterns or anything like that. Taking notes each day, noting, there are a lot of things that you can use to monitor what phase you're in yourself. It just depends on what you're comfortable with and what you're interested in. Things like monitoring cervical fluid, basal body temperature, things like that can be really useful for some women to figure out where they are in their phase. But really, even just tracking, like when you got your period, how you're feeling for the next days after, until the next time you get your period, just things like that. It can be as simple or as complicated as someone wants it to be. But looking over at that's where you're really going to be able to find, I think, the information that's going to be most useful for you as an individual, is looking at your own data and your own information.
That's awesome. So I guess to finish up here, Kim, I'd love to, give you the floor and just see if there was anything that we potentially missed that you'd like to cover, or you think that, is really important for both ladies and men to know or understand. If not, then we can wrap this one up.
Yeah, let's see. Ooh, things I want the world to know right now. I mean, luckily, I feel like I got to say some of my main points, which
Cool.
is, again, that I just think that it's so important for women to kind of take to be the judges of themselves, to be their, the decision makers of how they feel, what they want to do training wise and stuff. And I think for, men as well, to just for everyone to understand that it's like the menstrual cycle is complicated and nuanced and there's a lot of things going on. But I also think we shouldn't put it on this special pedestal. It's not the only thing that's going on. That's not the only thing that's existing for women is their menstrual cycle. There's, luckily we're fairly complicated creatures with a lot of other, biological systems and varying things going on. And so just to not see that isolated in a box or not put that as the only thing to blame, or that's let's point all fingers, if you're not feeling good, it must be your menstrual cycle. It's like, well, how'd you sleep? How'd you eat? How stressed are you? What's going on? There are a lot of other factors, and that our menstrual cycle, although, obviously I seem to think it's quite interesting, is not the only factor and is not the only thing to consider.
That's awesome, Kim. So I'd love for you to let the listeners know where they can find you, more information about you, and also let us know what you've got going on for the rest of the year and into 2022.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Let's see. So where people can find me and stuff. I'm not great at being a particularly public person with lots of social media or anything. I have an Instagram account, if anyone wants to follow me. When I do recruit for things, I do post it on my Instagram. And that's just my full name. It's Kimberly SantaBarbara. It's pretty easy. And let's see what I'm doing next. So research wise, I'm getting to do these kind of fun monitoring studies where I will be recruiting for more women. So those who are interested, where I'm looking at resistance trained women who are interested in basically tracking their own cycle. So everything I was just talking about, you get to do as part of a study and track, all these different symptoms as well. And then with a fun, I think it's fun, psychological intervention, which is going to involve mindfulness.
Awesome. That's great. Well, Kim, thanks so much for giving your time up and taking this deep dive with us. It's been super insightful for me, and I'm sure the listeners, both male and female, will take a lot from this one and be able to implement it into their own training and into their own monthly cycles, and kind of get a little bit better of an understanding of how their body works and how it affects themselves physically, but also psychologically as well. So I really appreciate you giving your time here, and I'm sure the listeners are gonna love it.
Great, thank you so much.